So, yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of the whole gender ideology thing, and we started an interesting conversation about it on Twitter about this idea of learning the gender ideology and then kind of snapping out of it. And you had mentioned that you were in the trans community when that happened, and maybe first we could kind of define what we mean by gender ideology.
Yeah, that's a good place to start, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
the kind of the I think the foundation of it is that somebody's internal sense of identity or proclaimed identity, and that's the tricky part is it's what's happening internally. That feeling seems to be so different for every person who uh, claims to be trans or transitions. So that's where it starts to get shaky. But that aside, um, I guess gender ideology is just the notion that whatever that professed identity is, it is paramount to biological sex. It basically erases your actual sex, and that internal identity is sacrosanct above anything else. And I'm not sure to what extent I believed it in that sense. Um, yeah, I don't. Yeah, what's your take on that? I mean, how would you define gender ideology?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. It's a tough question. I mean, I know what I think it means now, but I'm thinking about what did I think it meant back at the time when I first transitioned. And it was I don't think I had worked all that part out in my head, right? I mean, what it
Sure.
looked like for me in the community, because I was more in the butch femme scene,
Right. Yeah.
and um, and in that community, I mean, it was almost presented as here are your two options. You can be a butch, or you transition and be an FDM. And at that time, like that was 15 years ago, at that time, um, the butches and the trans men were in community together for the most part.
Right. Right.
And so it was sort of presented as here's your two options. Like
Okay.
um and I don't think anyone really believed that they were men. It was just a kind of a
Okay. Yeah.
kind of a different way to be a butch,
Yeah.
right? Like
Right. Okay.
to masculinize, and everyone had their own reasons for doing that. But
Right.
so
Yeah.
I mean, this whole idea of you actually become the other sex,
Yeah.
that's kind of a new thing. It seems like, especially in the last few years, it seems that that's really ramped up and has become the mainstream understanding. And I've been out of the loop from the trans community and the lesbian community for quite some time. So I was a little bit surprised that shift in thinking has happened.
Yeah, it was a surprise. I mean, I transitioned later than you did. I transitioned 10 years ago, so a bit later, kind of at the start of the mainstream boom of it. Let's say, I guess the real boom was probably about 5 years later in 2015. But so I was never really a part of the trans community, in that I didn't have any local trans friends, anything like that. I just had always had dysphoria. I found out that transitioning was something I could do. I went ahead and did it. I was on like quite a few online forums and stuff for trans men, but the thought process all along was that for me was certainly that I was a trans man, that I was always going to be female. That was never going to change, but I would be able to present and live um, uh, socially or even superficially as another man. And so that was my goal. And also for me at the time, I was thinking, because I didn't know any like trans men personally or in relationships or anything like that. So my thinking at that time as well was, this is me deciding to be celibate for the rest of my life, because nobody's going to want to be with like a man female hybrid thing, and that seemed like a perfectly reasonable trade-off to me as well. I was like, no, this fixing this means more to me than um, like a partnership, right? Like if that wasn't really a big deal to me. I've always been fairly solo, and it wasn't a big deal to me. And then it was basically, yeah. Anyway, so I transitioned again turned out I didn't have any problems dating people. But when I I had been out of this scene for about 7 years, right? So I was kind of heavy into the message boards since the beginning when I was first transitioning, and then I just started living my life.
Yeah.
I actually ended up going on getting a bachelor's degree. I had a couple of jobs in the meantime, and I was just sort of living life. Mostly, I think after about a year or so, I totally passed as a man and just lived as such. I wasn't stealth entirely. There was a period in my life a few years ago where I was stealth for all intents and purposes, but anybody who could like look through my Facebook timeline just a few years back is going to know. So I wasn't really super worried about it. It was just kind of like I am a trans man. Like it wasn't a big part of my life, but it certainly wasn't anything that I was hiding. And then it was 3 years ago I started dating another trans guy, and quite a bit younger than me. He was 25 at the time we started dating. I was 33, and that's when I got wind of how things had changed. And at first, I just thought that maybe he was a little bit weird, a bit a gung ho on gender juice. But then he would introduce me to some friends that were also like in the local trans community. I had no idea there was such a thing as a local trans community, but suddenly there were all these young trans men. And so at first I was like, dope. Like I'm quite homosexual in that direction, right? And so,
Yeah.
but then I started realizing, wait, this is actually pretty alarming. Like, so many of them were talking about transitioning despite they didn't have dysphoria, they were transitioning to be trans. And I was like, well, that sounds worrying. And then also, but at the same time, it's not saying no dysphoria. They would also say things like, well, I'm, I don't have female genitalia. I have male genitalia because I identify as a man. And that's when I was like, these two things are like, it just got to real loony land. It's like first of all, don't like you don't even have dysphoria. You transition to be trans, but that also you are male because you say you are. Like it was just like, and then the more people I would talk to online, because that's when I kind of woke up to it. So I got back into the trans community online, and they were all saying virtually the same things, and I was like, what is going on here? Like this is absolute madness. And then so again, that was about 3 years ago. The Rowling thing happened a year ago, and that's when I was like, okay, we've gone batshit, and
Yeah.
we got to start talking about this. So
I know, yeah, and that's been my experience in the community as well. That there's it's kind of like the worst thing about being trans is being a part of this community. I mean, I never had a lot invested in being a part of a trans community, but I was in contact with people because we were utilizing the same services, and I attended conferences and looking for support and things like that. And one of the hardest things I think about being trans is you're in this community with people that have such completely different ways of identifying and understanding their experience. And what people are experiencing now, whether it's the TERFs or people in the mainstream experiencing the hostility. I mean, that kind of hostility has been within the trans community for forever, and now it's become mainstream. But because you go to these conferences or you're on online forums or chat groups with other trans people, and as soon as you say anything about what you think gender dysphoria is, what it means to be trans, how do you identify, it immediately blows up into a big hostile fight.
Yep.
Because everyone seems to have their own version of what that means, and right, it's and it's so confusing, as you say, like when you really try to pull apart these identities and these narratives, that none of it makes sense. It's like, well, I'm trans, but no, I'm actually a man, and like the logic of it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the logic doesn't exist, I think, and so I think that's why it always breaks down into such infighting and such hostility, is because it's self-evident that these experiences are either unrelated or even contradictory in some senses. And so when you put your experience forward and completely conflicts with somebody else's experience, everybody has this sudden insecurity that, wait, this isn't real. Like when you present these conflicting narratives, it creates. I think it's very much the same reason why I think deeply religious people are quite hostile towards people who are deeply religious in another faith, is because it's like, we can't both be right, and it causes a great amount of insecurity, because it's like, one of us is profoundly wrong. In that case, and in this case, I think we're all wrong. So
Yeah.
there's no truth in any of it. So,
and you add that, you mentioned the dating thing, you add that, and it's just this extra layer of complication, because for those of us that, I'm no longer part of the lesbian community, but initially in my transition I was, and like I said, there were the butches, and then there were the trans men, and this tension between butches and trans men. I think a lot of butches really resented those of us that transitioned. They kind of felt abandoned and betrayed by us.
Right.
And then there's lesbians that will date both butches and trans men, and then trans men that get really angry about that, saying, well, if you're attracted to me, then you're not seeing me as a man.
Right.
So it's so complicated.
Yeah.
And that I think can really do a number on a person's mental health, is trying to find this narrative, right, that makes sense, because our brains work through narrative. We need a story to piece everything together, and there's no story that really makes sense.
Yeah.
Except, I think, the idea that we have gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
And this is a treatment for it.
Yep.
But we don't actually biologically change sex. I mean, that's the only narrative to me that makes sense, that I've been able to settle into, that doesn't cause that kind of constant cognitive dissonance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Same. I got there, I think, about just 2 years ago. I was like, because for a long time I sort of lived with this narrative that that my body was wrong, right? Well, that's obviously kind of where gender dysphoria comes from in the first place. But I meant, like, that was the actual narrative, is that there was something literally wrong with my body. My brain was correct. I was supposed to be male, right?
Yeah.
And so I for a long time I thought of myself as like a male with a birth defect. So that being female. So it's like, I never believed that I was male, but it was more like this, a narrative that you kind of tell yourself to cope with. And I thought that was relieving. I thought that was a relief to dysphoria, to think of it that way. But it's not at all. Like, once I realized, I was like, no, I am just a female who has gender dysphoria, and changing my body to cosmetically look, like a man and present as a man is relieving to me. Like, that's just, that's the most, grounding way to look at it. But then when you present this narrative to the community at large, you have internalized transphobia, and you're, invalidating your own identity.
It's interesting to me that the community has rejected a narrative that I actually find has been helpful for my mental health.
Right.
Because I tried different ways of doing this too, right? I mean, it's like kind of cycling through narratives over the last 15 years, trying to figure out, okay, like, how do I just kind of settle into this decision that I've made? Because transitioning did help my dysphoria.
Yeah.
But it was the narrative part that I could never really nail down in a way where I could just settle in and not have that constant sort of internal struggle. And where was I going with that? Yeah, so and so what I landed on, so maybe now we could talk about just kind of how we worked our way out of that, right? And landed on accepting that dysphoria it's all up here, right? Whether they end up realizing it's purely a mental health condition, or a cognitive condition, or a neurological one, whatever. Either way, it's in our heads, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So for me, I think I arrived there by reviewing the medical literature and discovering, there's no evidence for any of those other narratives. So whether the narrative of that this isn't psychological in any way, that it really is, that we have a male brain and it's our body that's wrong. I mean, that narrative would be fine if it was true.
Right.
But there's no evidence of that in the literature, right?
Right.
There's hardly, there isn't even evidence that there is a male brain and a female brain, let alone, so if you can't prove that, then how do we prove that we have a male brain?
Right.
There may be some evidence that there could be a neurological reason for gender dysphoria, but that's very different than a male brain and a female body.
It is. Yep. Like in our case, it could be like overexposure to testosterone in utero, right? Could give you that kind of more masculine interests, more masculine, let's say, identity, for lack of a better word. And that can certainly cause dysphoria, but that doesn't mean that your brain is literally male. It just means that, you might be more attuned to more masculine things than other girls,
Yeah.
But for me, what was just listening to, from what helped me dig out of it, was listening to other people, primarily detransitioners and people who are the never transitioners, as it were. People who, well, I've had dysphoria all my life and I've never transitioned, or people who transition despite never having dysphoria, or people who detransition despite having very clinical, like typical experience of dysphoria growing up, and transition didn't work for them. It's like, this isn't one thing. We are not just trans. This is a series of experiences that lead somebody to one conclusion or another, and it's how we work to solve it. That's relevant. But again, the gender ideology that we're trying to fight here is very much saying the exact opposite: is that we are born this way, and it is innate, and it is tantamount to torture to not let people, not let, I'm not about not letting, but like to not affirm immediately, right? And immediately affirming is obviously so dangerous for so many reasons. But yeah, that's how I dug out of it, was just listening to so many other people, and also like reading Blanchard and really paying attention when I would listen to the experiences of dysphoria, or just experience of transness, as it were, from the MTFs versus the F to Ms. And it's so clearly drawn on very female and very male lines. It's like, typically on our side of the aisle, it's very socially motivated, it seems. And then on the male side of the aisle, it's very sexually motivated, on whichever Blanchard typology you're looking at. And even if it isn't as dichotomized as Blanchard made it, it still seems to be from a very sexually motivated place in virtually all male to females. And then in our case, it rarely seems to be sexually motivated, except in the case of fleeing sexual abuse or sexual harassment, and like kind of hiding under a veil of male. And that's so important, to confront that. So
yeah, it's really hard, to get people in the community just talking about their, like why they did it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that people people cling so much to whatever narrative they've landed on, or, whether it's then I got a male brain and a female body, or just this, mysterious sort of gendered soul that sometimes people talk about. I mean, people cling to that so much, and it's hard to get them to open up about, well, come on. I mean, what was actually going on for you prior to making this decision to transition? What was going on for you? What were the different factors that motivated you to take that step? But those that in my life, and because people never talk about it in the public forums and stuff, but some of the guys that I have a close relationship with in my life have started opening up about that, talking about past histories of sexual abuse, or these different life stories, different motivations. Some have said they did it for political reasons, and never intended to be a man. They just more along the lines of the queer theory idea of female masculinity.
Okay.
Or some saying, well, no, I still identify as a butch, but I wanted to just appear more masculine.
Okay. Yeah.
So I mean, yeah. So I've heard all these different reasons for why people transition, but that's never the stuff that the public gets to hear. I don't think even most of the time, I don't think that the doctors are hearing that.
Yeah.
right? It's sort of these private conversations, and I haven't had any close trans female, trans women friends. So most of my social circle has been trans guys.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
don't, so I don't have much insight into the trans women's experience, really.
My experience entirely is well, I mean, I've known a few trans women personally via work and whatnot, but never like not on a like a friendship level, a deep like interpersonal relationship level. But where I've gleaned all of my insight is just lurking in online communities. I'm not sure what like what can be gleaned from that, but it's like communities where people are opening up and sharing with each other on the grounds of a similar experience and reading these things and just sort of like I'm just sort of like background data crunching it all, essentially, like just reading these stories and kind of turning it into some sort of this is all like not intentional. I'm not keeping a spreadsheet or anything, but I'm essentially just like slowly analyzing all this disparate information I'm gleaning from all these different social networks where these conversations are happening. So a lot of it could be inferred. Like what I'm getting is just sort of like could be partially inferred by my whatever bias is going into my analysis. Could be there as well. But yeah, that's where I've what I've been doing for the last 3 years is just watching YouTube videos of people's experiences and reading their forums and whatnot, and just sort of kind of subconsciously piecing it all together until suddenly I was like we are this is very dangerous the way that the medical profession is handling this, when it's all on the internet for anyone to see that this is not an innate thing, except maybe in the case of autogynephilia. That's the only thing that could be very much as I said, like unalterable, right? But that's another conversation, I think.
Has your gender dysphoria evolved over the years?
Well, it definitely transitioning virtually erased it. So that's kind of a not hypocritical, but in that while I'm very skeptical of medical transition, I do have to acknowledge that it did essentially cure my dysphoria. Like I had pretty bad dysphoria, most of which I was able to keep in the background, kind of compartmentalize all my life. Excuse me, sorry. I didn't have a word for it. I didn't know what gender dysphoria was, obviously. And again, I think we're also obviously lumping a bunch of disparate experiences into that category. But I always felt like I just wanted more than anything in the world to have been a boy. Like it was like it was an obsession. I felt like I've started to unpack where that came from, and I think it was just the fact that I was a tomboy and I was in a very conservative Christian upbringing, and I was constantly being told, "Don't do that. Girls do this. Girls do that. God made you a girl. Behave this way." And I think over time, I had a lot of shame about not being a girl so much as well. Okay, so I think I'm jumping forward, but I started to. I think I started to like kind of internally think that if I were a boy, I would be free, and all my friends were boys, and I think I just started to develop this idea that it was my body that was wrong because I really felt like I should be a boy, and so I didn't have sex dysphoria as a kid, but I think the sex dysphoria developed as a result of feeling like my body is not what it should be in order to be a boy. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I'm still trying to, because it's all mostly happened subconsciously, and I could be telling myself a narrative now that isn't actually the case when I was a kid. But this is what essentially makes sense. Thinking backwards. I remember this once. This is like one of my earliest memories is being in this preschool classroom in a school, excuse me, a Christian preschool classroom, and there was this young teacher up front. I think he was subbing in, or maybe he was just doing this presentation. So we were probably about 4 years old, 5 years old, possibly. And he's holding this phone book, and he's like, "Who wants to come up here and tear this phone book in half?" And I shot my hand up, and no other kid in the class did. And he's like, oh no, I was thinking one of the boys. And I remember being so ashamed right then, and none of the boys raised their hand, you know. And so, but I just remember thinking, why was I so enthusiastic? I've always been really, really shy in public settings, and that shame I felt right then, I think was like the catalyst for the shame to follow, or that kind of social anxiety that followed. And one of those, that was one of many instances where I was, kind of like shamed about behaving like a boy, which obviously it wasn't. I was just excited to try to tear a phone book in half, like there's nothing gendered about that. But anyway, so just little things like that I think I sort of internalized this, this supposed to be a boy feeling. And then as I grew up, I was very late to kind of develop, and have I was late to puberty, which is obviously, this is actually another trend that seems prevalent in female to male transitioners, is late onset puberty. Don't know why, but yeah, that seems to be a factor in there. I think Sasha and Stella were talking about it at one time, or maybe
that wasn't the case for me, but
okay.
I have heard that a lot of trans guys have gynecological problems, like
yes,
condition, which was true for me.
Yep. That was true for me. I started puberty late, and then when I had periods, they were agonizingly painful and also very irregular. So it was weirdly, I didn't have dysphoria about the period situation, which is also unusual. I had extreme dysphoria about my genital region in general, and certainly my chest. That my chest dysphoria was debilitating, but but the period thing never bothered me. I mean, it was incredibly painful and horribly inconvenient, but it didn't like have this kind of existential dread about gender or anything, which is weirdly usually not the case. But anyway, it was so so I didn't actually start like feeling kind of like sexual attraction until I was in my late teens, I want to say, and it was only ever to men, but it was always there was never any division between envy and attraction. Like it was basically the same feeling for me. And yeah, that never went away until eventually at the age of 27, I learned about, or 26, I learned about transitioning, and I learned the word gender dysphoria, and I was like, that's it. That's what it's always been. I'm not insane. Because I never told anyone what I was feeling. I always wished that I was a lesbian. I wish more than anything that I was, well, for most of all, I wish that I was a man, but obviously I couldn't do that. So it's like, man, I wished I was a lesbian.
Yeah.
The idea, but I had so much dysphoria about my own body. The idea of like women were, I projected my dysphoria. Like women in general were just repulsive. Like I'm not going to duplicate what is disgusting on my body. Like why would I be sexually interested in that? So I was only ever with men, and then at 26, when I decide, I think it was 27 when I actually started testosterone. My sexual orientation virtually shifted. I hadn't even had any surgery of any kind. It was just a few weeks on testosterone. It was probably placebo effect. Most of my own dysphoria went away, and suddenly women were everywhere, and they were just incredibly gorgeous. And it was weird. Like usually there's the other direction that because most FTM transitioners were lesbians, and then the testosterone screws with their sexual orientation, and I was like, well, testosterone can't make me gay. Everybody's saying it's making them gay. Can't make me gay because I'm already gay. Obviously we're using that word incorrectly here, but at the time that's what I was thinking.
I've never heard that happening to trans women. Ever.
No. I think our sexuality is much more fluid than theirs, and also hormones aren't going there. We take a hormone that drastically increases and intensifies our sex drive. It diminishes it, so it's not. I don't think it's not going to be the same. And I also think males are just more. I don't think their sexuality is as fluid as ours. I think it's a little more solid, but but anyway, yeah. So suddenly I was attracted to women, but that's leveled out. The attraction to men actually did ultimately come back, but there was no more envy. I'm now attracted to, like, if I'm attracted to men, it's gonna be like a pretty effeminate guy, and I'm gonna wish to anything he's actually FTM, because that's where my orientation lies now. So like, I've got a partner. We've been together for 3 years now. He's also FTM. But yeah, it's weird how it altered my sexuality to be primarily same-sex attracted in a way that always repulsed me before, but now I'm like, oh, dicks, like that doesn't sound good at all, you know. But anyway, yeah. So I think I'm not sure that I kind of went in a different direction there, but like my dysphoria again just fell off a cliff essentially after I kind of presented more male. Top surgery was still, no matter how gender critical I get, top surgery was the greatest day of my life. Like I have never once looked back from that. That was so relieving, and it's still to this day just a sense of great contentment to me that those are gone. And even if I don't have access to testosterone anymore, and like maybe things, fat ends up redistributing or whatever, I was like that I can live with, but they'll never grow back, and that's But I also, my heart goes out to many detransitioned women who have so much trauma about the fact that they had top surgery and now deeply regret it. And I feel really, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah. The idea of, rapid onset gender dysphoria, I'm really curious if they really experience that in the same way that those of us that had childhood onset gender dysphoria, like, is it the internal experience of that? I'm curious, is that the same? Because the narrative is that this is innate, and you're born with it, and just like being gay, right? You're born with it, and it never goes away, and so conversion therapy efforts are harmful because you can't coerce somebody to change that,
right?
But the idea of both detransitioners and rapid onset gender dysphoria really challenge that narrative, right? If someone can acquire gender dysphoria and it truly does internally feel exactly the same as childhood onset gender dysphoria, and then on the other side that some people can recover from gender dysphoria, it really challenges this narrative that it's just this innate, wired into our brains experience.
It definitely does. Yeah, it's well, I mean, a lot of the detransitioners too did have early onset gender dysphoria, and that was one of those things that made me realize, like, there's so many ways to look at this. But with rapid onset gender dysphoria, I think we're talking about at least two different things. With rapid onset gender dysphoria, there's kind of like either the like an obsessive fixation. Oftentimes there's like a history of eating disorders and depression and anxiety, and I think this is just latched onto as, this will fix it. This is the direction I need to go. And if you start like just hyper fixating, I think it can easily create what is very clinical gender dysphoria, when you're like, my body is wrong, this has to change, I need to, but it could just be born of a temporary obsession, right? But still feel every bit as real as any other kind of dysphoria, as real as any dysphoria can be, that is. But then in that same cohort of rapid onset gender dysphoria, we also have people who are literally attached to a trend, the political reason or whatever. It's like, this is a way to be queer, or this is just like, I don't know, this isn't the case for all like non-binary people, but a lot of people who are identifying as non-binary and then also seeking physical transition to some degree. I think a lot of that is kind of like, there is a trend, and it's somewhat glamorized to be trans right now. And I think if a lot of people who are just in need of a club or like a social cause, and this is really appealing. So this is certainly the case with like younger people. I don't think anybody in their mid or beyond 20s is going to fall for this, but younger people for sure. And then there's also the post-puberty onset of gender dysphoria, where these girls are suddenly getting a lot of male attention and they want to escape from it. And that can also present as very clinical gender dysphoria. So, okay, so that's at least three things that I would group under rapid onset gender dysphoria.
I've definitely met the type of young person that, very, very socially isolated, on the autism spectrum or ADHD. So they really struggle with social cues and fitting in. They don't have a peer group, and then they reach puberty where fitting into a peer group is so important. It's very developmentally important for that age group. And I mean, people say it sounds far-fetched, but I remember what it felt like to be a teenager, and how important it felt to belong somewhere, right? And
Yep.
when that is your developmental task,
Yep.
is to belong somewhere,
Yep.
I don't think we should kind of discount how powerful a drive that is. And it doesn't seem far-fetched to me at all that if they kind of, maybe meet some trans people online, they kind of feel like they belong somewhere for the first time,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
and the whole trans movement has become this kind of this orthodoxy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you just learn these rules, then it simplifies social engagement, because
Yeah.
you just throw a kid in a high school, social, and they have autism or ADHD or something. Social interactions can feel quite complicated.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're not picking up on social cues. But if you have this structured orthodoxy, and people just need to learn how to behave according to that, almost like like a rule book.
Yep. Yeah.
um,
Yeah. And this provides that. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. No, that's such a good.
so they
such a-
find this kind of quirky peer group to belong to for the very first time, and so I could see the appeal,
Yeah. Yeah.
which
Yeah.
in itself isn't bad.
No. No.
It's the if they take it a step further into the medicalization of it, that's where I start to have concerns. Like, to what extent do we want to be kind of promoting this idea that you need to medicalize your body and cut off parts of your body in order to fit into a social group?
Yeah. 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 Because the scary thing is, as you said, that's a completely normal developmental state for certainly young teenagers, all teenagers, right? Well, all of us in general. But I mean, that it seems almost criminal to me that clinicians, that mental health care workers, who obviously are trained in developmental psychology, are completely throwing this all away and just pretending that this is innate. And it's like everybody's gone completely completely religious, because so it's all propagated by, like you said, so not these only are these kids in need of a social community, they found it. It also provides the answers as to why they're so socially awkward. It's like, oh, it's because I'm trans, right? And that also makes you kind of like among the saints now. So you're not just the awkward, goofy kid who can't make friends. You're now basically part of this chosen few with this cool thing, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got the external culture just glamorizing and glorifying it and praising you every step of the way. And then you have a current medical system that validates it with hormones and surgery. And it's like, we've every step along the way, we've all lost our minds. Like, this is not how we should be approaching normal developmental identification, and kind of working out who you are.
Yeah.
is to chemically and surgically alter children. It's just, or young adults. It's just yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the clinicians that have specialized in this work and have been specializing in this work for quite some time, they're immersed in that culture as well, right? Along with the trans people immersed in this orthodoxy, and have become trans activists themselves, and so I think they've got the same blinders as a lot of trans people do, right?
Yeah.
Because they've been immersed in it so long, and I think. So I'm impressed that some of the longtime clinicians have stepped forward and said, okay, look, something's kind of gone off the rails here. So I'm impressed that some clinicians have been able to do this work for many, many years, but have been able to maintain that clinical lens and not become.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Because what I've seen with some clinicians is never identified as trans, but then over the course of their career being immersed in this culture, have started to adopt trans identities themselves. I mean, it is. So, I mean, that, and yet they deny that a contagion exists.
It's amazing. Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, well, because they're human and susceptible to the cultural influences, just like everybody else is.
Yeah.
And it's just really remarkable that people start so like an adult professional is working in that capacity and starts to kind of realize, like, oh, this presenting with this means you're trans, or this feeling means you're trans. I'm trans too, like I've got that, or I've felt that way, or I'm not really comfortable with this such a thing. I'm
Yeah.
trans too. And so it's kind of remarkable that they would go, oh, I'm trans too, rather than going, wait a second, these are all just normal human experiences that we're kind of putting into this very rigid rigid box, and
Yeah.
latching onto it.
We used to just
Yeah.
call that personality. Right?
Yeah, yeah, so much of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the culture's been inundated with this idea that like, this pink and blue, it's like there are men and there are women, and women feel this way and men feel this way, which is obviously not true. But then people are going, oh, well, I feel a bit of this and a bit of that. I guess I'm trans, rather than I'm just a normal person, with a myriad of experiences and feelings.
It's been very clever marketing.
Yes,
Hasn't it?
yes.
Very, very
Yeah.
clever.
Yeah, just
So I have
co-opt
a
that
love-hate
rainbow.
relationship with it, right? Because there's a part of
Yeah.
me that's like, man, Judith Butler was smart.
Oh yeah.
I mean, as much as I see the damage that these ideas have done to me personally, to my friends, to now society at large, but at the same time, you have to kind of respect how very smart the marketing has been.
Yeah.
To advance things as quickly as they have, and I appreciate having rights, but it hasn't stopped there, right? We've had rights now for quite some time.
Yeah.
And now it's becoming counterproductive to our goal to just belong in society and have rights and not be harassed. Now it's gone to the point where we're convincing, well, everybody is some degree of trans.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we've reset the normal. That trans is actually the normal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And if you're not trans, then you're actually the minority and something's wrong with you. It's kind of the message that I feel like it's sort of flipped on its head, right? That we've got a case here in Canada that's going to be heard by the Human Rights Tribunal in Ontario, because a little 6-year-old girl came home from school one day very upset, saying that her teacher told the class that there was no such thing as boys or girls. And so the girl came home upset, saying, but I feel like I'm a girl. So can you take me to the doctor? Because something might be wrong with me. So that's how we've now completely reversed this.
Yeah.
Into, that it isn't biological sex in girls and boys that are normal, and we're the outlier because we have this condition called gender dysphoria. Now it's been flipped as, well, no, the gender identity is something that everybody has. And they teach kids the gender spectrum. So on one side is G.I. Joe and the other side is Barbie, and they get kids to plot themselves on this spectrum. And it's like so anywhere, if you're not G.I. Joe or Barbie, then you're some degree of trans.
It's that's why it's gender ideology. That's or genderology. Like it's a religion, and we're teaching it in schools, and we don't teach religion in schools for very good reasons. I mean, I'm in the U.S. We can't. I don't know. Like in Canada, I'm sure that's the same way. As you can't teach a religion in a public school. Maybe the theory of it, but these kids are being indoctrinated into the gender religion, and it's way more mentally harmful than any other religion I've ever encountered. It's blowing my mind that this can even be happening.
Yeah, it's frightening.
Yeah.
Really frightening.
It's disturbing a lot of kids. Yeah. And making it's not just indoctrinating them into because like that little girl and plenty of more kids to come are going to be like, well, for her, she's like, I do feel like a girl, and she is a girl, so that's good. I mean, it's obviously upsetting her, but at least maybe she's not going to fall into the wrong line of thinking on that one. But plenty of other kids are. It's like, oh, G.I. Joe's cooler than Barbie. I like G.I. Joe. All right, puberty blockers for me. It's just.
It's sort of like kids are being taught that, well, you can just pick whatever sex you are. You can, this is just a choice that every single kid out there can make, that you can either be a boy or you can be a girl.
I want to follow this. I haven't read much by Jennifer Bilek and her kind of investigations, but there's got to be so much pharmaceutical lobbying that gets to this point, because like. Why else are we teaching kids this? Like, why? Gender dysphoria used to be just like relegated to such a small portion of the population. It's a very rare condition to have, and I didn't even have it to the extent that I would have sought out a doctor on my own volition. Like I just always thought I was insane until I found it externally, right? So so I wouldn't have even been one of those people who transitioned on my own accord. It took the internet, right?
Mhm.
So so yeah, there could I don't know where I'm going with this other than this is not a natural state to be. This is not a normal state of human affairs to alter your body in the direction of the other sex. Like
Mhm.
it's why can't I know why I couldn't see it for a long time, you know? But I had gender dysphoria and I told myself this narrative of why I had to change sex, right?
Yeah.
But I don't understand how people outside of it don't go, human beings can't fucking change sex. Why are we teaching this to kids? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like you say, now we're not clownfish.
We are not. Yeah. Yeah.
Where things are complicated for me, I mean, I don't know if because you're American, I don't know if down in the US, if I imagine like Canada, there's regions where these ideologies are kind of hotter than others, and
Sure.
we're both on the West Coast. So in the Vancouver, Victoria coastal areas, this stuff is we're a real hotspot here. And had I not moved to Vancouver, like if I had stayed on the East Coast or in the prairies, I'm not entirely sure that I would have ended up transitioning.
Right.
Maybe
Right.
at some point, but it wasn't until I moved to Vancouver and and encountered just the prevalence of this way of thinking.
Okay.
That it started to kind of
Yeah.
that idea. I definitely had gender dysphoria,
Right.
but I was finding ways to make sense of that, as part of a lesbian identity. There were lots of, butch lesbians, and then the drag king scene became popular for a while there. I don't know if it still is, but I would go to house parties, in different parts of Canada, and go there, and there'd be women dressed as men, but they weren't trans men, and they had, to my knowledge, none of them have transitioned. It was a part of lesbian culture, and I felt pretty comfortable with that, and I made sense of it that way until I moved to Vancouver. And
okay, yeah.
but 15 years ago in the lesbian community, back then it was called gender identity disorder, not gender dysphoria, and that was talked about pretty openly, and that was kind of thrown around that the would talk about having gender identity disorder. And I think that was actually a protective factor for me, that I did have quite a few years in the lesbian community and these conversations about gender identity disorder, and that both gay men and lesbians experienced it, and that just seemed to be part of the gay and lesbian culture. And I think having so many years of that has been a protective factor for me to not kind of buy into these ideologies to the same extent that others have, because I know that there are a lot of lesbians and gay men out there that have it, and they're not trans, and they've never transitioned. So there's options, right? I mean, transitioning, it's the idea that what happened to me is I saw a documentary on TV, unfortunately at a time in my life where I was undergoing a lot of stress, and there had been a gay man who had been murdered in a park in Vancouver, that had happened fairly recently, and that was on my mind, and it was really disturbing for the entire gay and lesbian community, that this very vicious murder, it was a targeted hate crime where I think it was 2 or 3 guys came in from the suburbs into Vancouver with the intention of finding a gay man to beat the shit out of him, and they found him in Stanley Park and beat him to death. Jeez. And so that was really weighing on me, and it just different, the breakdown of my first marriage, and then when my daughter had just been born, so there was a lot going on at that time. And I saw this documentary on TV talking about trans kids, and that if you have these feelings, these cross-sex identification feelings, that meant you are a trans person, right? So and that started to like a little worm in my brain. It's like, okay, so it started to break down my identity, right? And it started, it's like, okay, so well, that's how I feel. And I felt that way right from like my very earliest memories, like around age 3, feeling that way. So I thought, oh, well, then I guess I'm one of those trans people, that I'm not actually gay or lesbian after all.
Yeah.
right? And so when you have doctors and the mainstream media and teachers and authority
Yep.
figures saying this to us,
Yeah.
it has a, a believability because we want to trust these people in these positions of authority. So I thought, okay,
Yeah.
so it completely, flipped my identity at a time where I think I was just more vulnerable and feeling, because of that murder, feeling more afraid in the world, because I've always
Yep.
been very just innately masculine, and I
Mm.
do have an intersex condition, so my testosterone levels are
Right.
high. I always
Okay.
was just very, not a GI Joe, but more innately masculine. And
Right.
even at times in my life where I tried to kind of put on a more feminine appearance just to try to fit in better, it
Yep.
didn't work for me. It looks so awkward, and
That's the
it just
same. Yep.
so
Yep.
um I think I was just terrified at that point, because I did receive a lot of harassment, like just walking down the street, appearing the way that I did.
Mm.
You'd get homophobic slurs, screamed at me and stuff, and it really wore me down after a while. And
Right.
year after year of experiencing that kind of homophobia. Um, in hindsight, I think this was kind of like a loophole that I found.
Right.
Not that I didn't have legitimate gender dysphoria, but the reasons for transitioning, I think, was kind of a loophole for me to, it's like, okay, here's my escape from,
A trap door.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because now I can walk down the street and nobody bothers me, right? Like I just kind of blend into the world.
Yep.
But then when I moved away from Vancouver, so I'm now living, kind of in a little town in the interior, and so I'm not immersed in that culture anymore. That's when all of this started to just kind of dissipate. Not the gender
Okay.
dysphoria, but that ideology started to dissipate, because
Okay.
now I have to just live in the world and try to carve out a space for myself as a trans man in a world where that's not really on people's radar in the same way, and people aren't immersed in that culture anymore, and it's complicated, because so then I've tried to do the stealth thing, but that's a heavy burden psychologically, to always have
Yeah.
to try to edit your stories and edit your history, and that's
Yeah.
exhausting trying
Yeah.
to do that, right? So
Yes, it is. Yep. Yep. I
but
think.
so for me, the idea of just embracing that, okay, I've got gender dysphoria, and I've chosen this treatment, but I'm still a female with gender dysphoria that's masculinized, and that's the only, I think that's the truth,
Yeah.
and B, I think that's what the evidence supports. I mean, I've been looking at the evidence. There's no evidence of a gender spectrum. There's no evidence of a gender identity. There's no evidence of a male brain, female brain. So the only
Yep.
thing that makes sense is just embracing that, okay, the gender dysphoria as a condition exists.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. For a variety of reasons. As far as the brain goes, I think there is evidence. Well, there's trends, right? That males brains typically look and function a little bit differently, but like we're talking about general trends. We're not talking about you can identify a person's sex by their brain. But I think the studies that were used to support the trans narrative were done on uh, basically highly highly butch lesbians as as the trans men, and then highly effeminate, what Blanchard would call HSTS.
Mhm.
So anyway, I'm not good at kind of regurgitating the research, but apparently what others have said is essentially what they were taking was hyper homosexuals, that and basically showing that their brains function similar to the opposite sex. Therefore, trans women more like regular women, but it was not about gender. It was about sexual orientation.
Yeah.
So what would my brain look like under the same circumstances? Because I was always oriented towards males, and naturally, rather, before additional testosterone. I wouldn't be, my brain wouldn't come out. Oh, I don't know. But again, when we're talking about the hyper or the overexposure to testosterone in the womb, potentially could be the result of more masculine interests, and more masculine identification, as it were. And then obviously the whole weird puberty, probably endometriosis is probably what I had. I was never diagnosed, but things like that. I'm not sure if that correlates, but we don't know at this point. And you obviously can't research what causes dysphoria or anything like that anymore, because again, it's gonna quash the narrative of gender. But I don't think gender exists. I don't think we have a gender. I think I also like gender identity disorder, like I was writing about in that conversion therapy piece I wrote, is that gender identity disorder makes much more sense to me and feels much more accurate than gender identity. Like, to identify as a man is meaningless. But having a gender identity disorder, that feels accurate to where dysphoria comes from, in our case, certainly. But what else was I going to say? Oh, it was interesting what you were saying, because you're in Vancouver, I'm in Bellingham, right? So like we exist very much, and then if you follow that all the way down to probably San Francisco, on this side of the Cascades, we're all drinking the same juice. It's like that same Cascadia culture. You get east of the mountains, and we're, at least on my side of the border, it's a completely different world as far as culturally and how the trans issue is probably discussed. But on this side, it's very one story, and that is the gender juice. But yeah, sorry, that was jumping around, kind of touching on a few things that you said in there.
And despite the fact, you were talking earlier about how within the trans community, there really hasn't been a single narrative. I mean, because there is all that infighting. It's no, it's this, no, it's this, no, I identify this way, no, I identify, as trans, and I never wanted to actually, appear the opposite sex. Like some actually, I've heard people say, when they're taking testosterone, they're actually upset by how much it masculinizes them, because they wanted to kind of fit more in that,
gray space,
neutral space. And so you hear all these stories. And so it's interesting how just this one single narrative has rose to the top in terms of policy and law. And I don't understand how that happened, because there's no consensus in the clinical community or within the trans community about what this means and how we've constructed our identities. But these certain ideas have, so people are speaking on our behalf, saying this is what it means, and we're going to write policy at an international level based on one person's perspective on what it means to them.
Yeah, and it completely conflicts with this other person's perspective. And when you branch the two together, they conflict and invalidate each other, making the whole thing fall apart. But everybody just pretends, oh no, it's just one happy community, and it all makes sense under this trans umbrella. And it's just, it's madness. But like what you're saying with like people who are offended, or like they start taking testosterone, and then I've noticed this as well, as like people are upset that they're being treated like men. It's like, well, I don't want to be a man, and that was again one of those when I kind of got wind of the massive explosion of FTM transitioning. One of them that I was friendly with at the time was saying that that they never wanted to pass as a man; they wanted to pass as a trans man, and I was so profoundly offended by that when I heard it. It was like because that was an insecurity that I always had. It's like, I don't want to be this third thing. It's like, I feel like I should be a man. I want to live and present as a man. But there's no getting around the fact that I just am a trans man. Being a man is not possible. But anyway, it was just so, and then he seemed just completely dumbfounded by the idea that I just wanted to live and be a man in the world. And he was like, oh, I want to be trans, and I'm as offended when people don't see him as a trans man, but as a man. And so my initial feeling was just so much anger, and like but then, and there were a lot of other things I got wind of that were along those same lines, where my initial feeling was just, I was so offended. I felt like this is like the most cruel not the most cruel, but it is the most dangerous appropriation, that's for sure. And so those feelings of anger at that quickly shifted to how widespread that thought process is, and how widespread, therefore, of a medical emergency we have on our hands here, and that my being offended about my identity being invalidated or whatever is kind of small beans in the grand scheme of what's happening here.
Yeah, they're competing agendas.
Yeah, yeah,
When
yeah,
some people are just, doing the stealth thing, and they're just trying to, they transitioned and now they're just out in the world, blending in and just getting on with their lives, living as men. And then those that they very much kind of wear the sort of the big trans banner over their heads everywhere they go, right? Like it's
yeah,
really
yeah,
important for them to be seen through that kind of rainbow lens.
yep,
So they are competing agendas, and and that I think the radicalization of trans politics is making it a lot harder to just live in the world and get on with my life. And it's making it, I think, less safe. So on one hand, trans has become very powerful, the trans lobby,
yeah,
and has
yeah,
advanced very quickly, but it's also fueling this more and more hostility towards everything queer and trans. And it's interesting how seeing it play out in the UK, because I think they're a few years ahead of us in seeing this play out and
yeah,
progress. And um, it's interesting that those who identify as transsexuals, who really do want to just exist in the world as the opposite sex and have learned how to do that successfully, are the ones stepping forward and saying, well, no, I'm not actually
hmm,
the other
hmm.
sex. I'm just living as the other. So I don't know how to articulate it. That
It's
is
contradictory, isn't it?
contradictory, yeah. But
Yeah,
but they're the ones stepping forward. But I think it's because, and I would say I fall into that category
sure,
where
yeah,
I'm living
yeah,
my life as a man. And I think I do that fairly successfully. But I think when you live in authentic relationship with people, that requires honesty.
yeah,
And I think the political lobby, I don't know that they really believe that they really change sex either, but they're projecting that image, right? That we're
yeah,
this unyielding political lie, basically, this political fiction that they're just kind of pushing onto the world with no negotiation. So it's this very authoritarian,
yeah,
we're not going to compromise.
yep,
That I think is doing far more harm than good, because you can't have trusting, authentic relationship of any kind based on a force, forcefulness and a lie.
yeah,
So they
yeah,
end up being much more successful politically, certainly in my social world, of just saying, hey, this is my reality. I had gender dysphoria. This is the treatment I sought. It's been helpful. I'm not trying to harm anybody. I'm not trying to lie or
right,
pull the wool over anyone's eyes here. I'm
right.
just getting on with my life. I think that's, for most people, that's what they need,
It's
right?
very reasonable to most people
Yeah.
too, but instead this contradictory kind of Orwellian um, uh, hellscape has been imposed, where people are, yeah, they're forced to lie, and that obviously makes people very, very resentful, and it's very counterintuitive to certainly trans acceptance and trans rights. And but what I was saying is contradictory is that it is interesting that it's us, the transsexuals, who are saying, no, 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 we are, either male or female. We are transitioned to present as the other sex. It is it's a cosmetic fiction that makes us feel better, and then it's the people who are who are just, yeah, as you said, like uppercase T, just really stoked on all things trans and being this um uh, yeah, this other, right? Like it's somewhere in the middle, and they're the ones who are being so authoritarian and forcing this lie, which again, it's a lie that they don't even believe, because they don't even yeah, yeah, it's very hard to articulate what's going on.
Yeah, and then the whole language issue, right? The compelled
Yeah,
speech, the rewriting of language, the birthing parent or birthing person rather than mother,
and the
and
vilification of women who object to being erased by this language. It's like,
that's not happening to men. Like, we don't,
no, no,
men aren't being called testicle danglers or whatever, right? Like it's only
yeah,
it's
yeah,
only the female language that's being rewritten. And
yeah, yeah,
early in my transition, I had to sit in gynecologist's office, and yeah, it feels awkward, whatever, but it never occurred to me that I need to rewrite the language that everybody uses to accommodate me and make my awkwardness feel better. Like,
Right. Yep. Yep.
so
Yeah.
that's a very new phenomenon, right? That
It is. It is. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know how the I think not to be too gender or whatever, but I think that's certainly a more female way of approaching the situation, is like, I'm going to blend myself into this situation and not cause a fuss. And I think what we see, most of the activism is happening on the male to female transitioner side. I mean, I'm curious though what it was like in the past before this forced fiction was imposed, because I think much of the forced fiction is due to autogynephilia, right? Basically these male to female transitioners who their content, or their kind of sense of identity, is a 24/7 fiction. And when anything is presented to them that contradicts that fiction, it's just hostility, and they will not tolerate it. They won't stand for being misgendered, right? And so when there's anything that is presented to them that points out that they are not female, they cannot have it. And I think that's why we're rewriting female language and not rewriting male language, is because for us, we don't live, and I don't think this is the case for any, or at least not very many FTM transitioners who are living a 24/7 fantasy. It's like we're pretty aware of what it is we've done and we're doing, and what we are. And even the ones who are all gung-ho on the gender juice are still, they're actually probably more in touch with their, I belong in womanhood and yada yada. That seems to be the case with them. But so in the past, I think most of the female to male, or the male to female transitioners were the HSTS kind, who were also aware of the fact that they were male. Their experience of gender dysphoria is more attuned, I think, with ours, is that it's more comfortable to live and present as a woman. It's helpful for their sex lives, to do that. And but they were aware of the fact that they were male. Like, I don't think, but with the autogynephilia kind of taking center stage now, and of course, it's taking center stage, but nobody knows it or is allowed to say it. But that's what's happened, is autogynephilia has taken center stage, and these heterosexual males who are aroused or even just attracted to being women, that's a fantasy they have to 24/7 sustain, or it falls apart, because they're not naturally feminine. They're not, it is 24/7 fantasy. And then they're using that same kind of very entitled perspective to shove laws down other people's, on our behalf. It's like, we don't want this. Nobody else wants this, but they pretend that their agenda, that their desires are the trans community. I'm not speaking in specifics. I'm speaking very vaguely, but it's just something I've noticed. I'm not sure if you're kind of seeing the same thing.
Yeah,
or...
I'm seeing the same thing.
Okay.
And I've wondered that too, like, what is driving this changing of the language around womanhood, right, or mother?
Right. Yeah.
Because I have trouble believing that that's being driven by trans guys, because it dehumanizes us too.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we're just birthing people.
Yeah.
It's
menstruators.
Yeah. It dehumanizes all of us. And maybe there are, some trans men out there kind of pushing this, but nobody I know. So it does make more sense to me that it's a certain cohort of trans women who don't want to be excluded from the word woman.
Yep. And I would agree with that. Yeah. Whereas again, and I think with the cultural shift to trans being good and beautiful and glamorous and wonderful, a lot of these, heterosexual men who maybe had this private fantasy that they lived out occasionally, are now able to bring it into a full-time, because it's no longer vilified. It's now actually opposite. It's, well, depending on where in the world you are, but it's glamorized and it's praised. And so I think autogynephilia is much more common than we previously would have thought. Certainly more than Blanchard would have thought in his research, because again, these are only the people who are desperate enough, and it's so, because it does cause, certainly later in life, very severe gender dysphoria, and that's, where people are drawn to actually get orchiectomies and vaginoplasties and whatnot, is because the gender dysphoria at their body contradicting that fantasy, it becomes very, very severe. But I think in the past, when trans was so vilified, and these were just heterosexual men, and they could just get on with life as heterosexual men, as long as they didn't develop debilitating dysphoria. But so again, now that it's so praised and celebrated, I think a lot of these, certainly young men are going, wait, I've always felt this way, and then they go on online forums, they're like, oh, it means you're trans, it's like, oh, great, like it's very.
It really feeds into the AGP mindset. And Blanchard tweeted recently that for some, exhibitionism can be a feature of AGP.
Yeah.
And it makes sense if AGP, if you think of it as like a sexual orientation, that wouldn't wax and wane, right? A sexual orientation tends to be a permanent part of a person, same as being straight or gay. So it makes sense that wouldn't wax or wane. Whereas for me, my dysphoria the intensity of it has waxed and waned throughout my life. And I don't need to actually believe that I'm the opposite sex in order to resolve the dysphoria. For me, just physical cosmetic changes to my body resolves it. And I do think a lot of the anxiety that I had been feeling as a result of gender dysphoria was more about how other people were interacting with me. Like I said, that homophobia of being the far outlier on the male end of being a female person.
Right.
So like you said, the homosexual type of gender dysphoria, that they got some lesbians or women that are just so masculine that's hard in society, or guys that are just so innately feminine that it's hard for them in society, and it's just easier for us to fit into the world as it is by transitioning. But we don't really have that same invested interest in actually convincing ourselves that we are sex. AGP doesn't work, right? That
unless it's convinced,
it's convincing, and everyone believes it, and that you can convince yourself.
Yep. And then anything that contradicts it, anything that abuts the fact that it's not true, it seems to cause a lot of anger and resentment, and
and they're working against our interests, because my agenda and why I'm starting to speak out about stuff is knowing the impact of homophobia on my decision to transition. Something has to be done about homophobia. I mean, I found this loophole and took the escape hatch, but I still care about homophobia, and we still need to do something about homophobia, right? I don't want to be Iran, where all gay and lesbian people transition in order to escape homophobia, right? So I want to advocate, as many of us advocate for true gender diversity, in the sense that women get to be a whole range of things, and that should be socially acceptable, and men should get to be a whole range of things, and that should be socially acceptable, and actually really truly embrace diversity, so that we don't have to take lifelong. That's a huge burden for me, to take on lifelong medicalization. The surgeries are awful. The medication is now at this point in my life having an impact on my health. That's a huge burden on us in order to escape homophobia. So something needs to be done about that. But the AGPs don't really like that agenda.
No. In fact, a lot of the trans activism is actually it is homophobia in and of itself, or at least it's denying the reality of same-sex attraction, and it's very counterintuitive to the rest of the rainbow's interests. But I agree with what you're saying. Is like if the homophobia, I couldn't call it homophobia in my case, obviously, but I think a lot of the early life social signaling that I guess a lot of probably butch lesbians experience is similar to what I experienced, even though I didn't actually end up growing up to be a lesbian. But it was very much this constant, like, girls don't behave this way, you're not acting right. And then as being too masculine, and here and getting those external social feedback that makes you feel wrong in some way. And I think that's what a lot of highly masculine girls who are going to grow up to be lesbians and highly effeminate boys who are going to grow up to be gay men internalize this message. It becomes their body is wrong and we have to change our bodies in order to but like in your experience, that like, so homophobia wasn't really an issue for me, obviously, because I was only attracted to men. But for me, I had a lot of dissonance about dissonance. I think that's the word, cognitive dissonance, because to me, I was a gay man. Like I was just like this stupid. I make fun of it now, but I very much felt like I was a gay man in a woman's body. Right? It's like my sexual orientation wasn't that big of a factor, so much that it was like I could kind of be in my head, I thought of myself as male, right, all along. I even ended up marrying a man because I was attracted to him. Like I definitely fell in love and everything, but I had so much dissonance around the fact that I was like female, or that I was attracted to men and I was actually female. But to me, the concept that I was a straight woman just did not exist. Like that, it was just wrong. It felt like an absolute lie. And so that's a side story. But anyway, so I never had, I didn't have to deal with homophobia. So there was never anything external. It was all internal for me. It's like, this is not right. I am not what is seen, what is reflected. Which of course I was. It was just dysphoria, that was making all this noise in my head about it all. But anyway, but so no, I didn't experience homophobia as after as an adult, right? And so that didn't ever play a part in my decision to transition like it did for you, where you continue to get that external social messaging telling you that you're not right, that you don't fit in with the rest of the male, female, man, woman population, and that never went away for you.
Yeah. And I think both of us have probably been accused of aligning ourselves with the the evil turfs.
Oh yeah.
But for me, what they're saying, and I mean, I was a feminist long before I transitioned, and what they're saying fits better in alignment with my goal socially, not personally, but socially, that this idea that we need to do something about gender stereotypes, and we need to actually embrace true diversity. That's what the feminists have been doing long before trans ever became a hot topic, of expanding what it means to be a woman and expanding what it means to be a man, so that people can just innately be themselves without feeling like they need to fit into these tight little boxes. So it's interesting to me how the feminists and the gender ideology is kind of really butting heads over this. But for me, it's just kind of a no-brainer, that because my goal is to expand and make it more socially acceptable for people to be outliers on the far ends of that spectrum, not the gender spectrum, but that there's a range of innate personalities and physical traits within the female sex class and the male sex class, and we shouldn't have to cross over to being male just because we're the far outlier on the traits, right? So ideally people wouldn't need to transition, because they could just innately be themselves and express themselves and feel safe in the world. And so those that are, and it's not all AGPs, I really respect those that have come forward and say, yes, I have AGP. I really, like the Debbie Haytons, and I really respect that, because we can work with that, right?
Absolutely,
it doesn't have to be, it's this horribly pathologized thing, as long as people are willing to be honest and engaging respectfully in the world. So I have absolute respect for that. And it makes it a lot harder for people to kind of bury the reality of AGP when people are stepping forward and saying, well, actually I have it. So
exactly.
But those that are
and they hate us for that. Not I mean, like obviously the AGPs hate the self-aware AGPs, but I think the trans community at large hates it when they come forward and be like, oh no, it's just this and this, and that's when they're like, self-hating, internalized transphobia, shut up, turf, they hate it.
So I mean, all this conflict that's brewing in our society, more so in the UK than here, but I do think it's coming here quite soon. I think we're probably about a year or so out, just in my read of kind of the rumblings underground.
Mhm.
Um, I feel like that conflict is mostly between AGP and feminism,
Yeah. Yeah.
less so than just trans and feminism.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Agree. I think, yeah, that is the primary. Obviously, a lot of the feminists have take issue with masculine girls being told societally that they need to transition. Obviously, feminists are going to take a big issue with that. But as far as the actual policy
The
changes,
the ideological butting heads.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep. I would agree with that.
Because I don't feel like I'm at odds with feminism at all.
Nor I.
It
No.
actually better explains my experience than
Yep.
the gender ideology does.
Oh, exactly.
And so
Yep.
it's important to me that this becomes part of the public debate, because I don't want to go down with the ship, right?
Exactly.
Because I don't feel like I'm in conflict with the world, and I don't feel I'm in
No.
conflict with women, and I'm more than happy to have a public conversation about, okay, how do we make this work so that everyone's safe and everyone can get along, and I'm not trying to invade anyone's private spaces. And what Buck
Right.
says, like, we get to carve out our own spaces, not just hijack other people's spaces. So.
Yeah. And I think that's where the bathroom issue becomes such a contentious issue, is also from the AGP angle, is because they want to colonize spaces specific for females to validate their gender identity without any regard for the feelings of the people already in that space, for any fear that they may be causing and that's the reality of AGP, is they rarely pass, and so it's like, so they don't consider the fact that that's what's so telling about the male entitlement, is like they think that they can just, well, it's like, I'm a woman by law, I belong in this space, without any consideration for how the actual women in that space feel about it. And that's not something you would ever see like a homosexual, like the Blanchard typology, an HSTS behaving that way. I can't imagine it anyway. I don't know if that's the case, but it just seems like a very AGB behavior, where it's like, this space exists to validate my, and again, no offense at all to the AGBs who are not behaving this way, but I think it's a result of the prevalence of transitioning heterosexual autogonophilic men.
And there's this
Anyway.
underlying, like, well, sometimes overt, but otherwise underlying kind of seething hostility towards women.
Yes.
Yes.
You have this thing I want so badly to have and will never have, is what.
And you're telling me no, right?
Yes. Both of those things. Yes. Yeah. And that's the weird thing, is like I've said before, it's like they seem less in touch with actual women than any other heterosexual men do, because they see something that they want to possess. They're obviously, heterosexual men can be quite possessive of women, but in a very different way. Like, well, I mean, literally possessed, like literally to entirely co-opt, and they see an object they wish to possess and embody, and less so a full human being, because to them so much of womanhood is just a performance and a costume. And it's like, and here is this, it's hard for me to articulate, but it seems to me that they are less in touch with actual women's inner lives and feelings than any other heterosexual men are, just because of that covetousness, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. It's sort of a lack of empathy sometimes.
Entirely. Yeah. Yep. Yes, indeed. Yep. I think we've got some good stuff here, Aaron.
Yeah, I think so.
This is good.
I'd love to, moving forward. I mean, happy to chat with you one-on-one anytime, but it would be great to pull in other trans guys too, and just kind of the kinds of conversations that we're used to having, just sitting around, the campfire or in the living room and having a beer or a coffee and just chatting, right? Because we have these private conversations all the time, but I think we're at a point in history where we need to to open that up and let the world into those conversations.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Certainly at a time when so much propaganda is out there that pulls the wool over what these individual experiences are. People need to know. So, and then also my prayer, Mary, when I was thinking about like putting together like a project, I was just going to interview a bunch of trans men, but I'm such a planner and very little action ever happens. So I'm really thankful that you reached out to do this, because it's so, we just have a conversation, and like anybody can tune in and watch or participate. Is a good way to go about it. But I think what's most important is for people who are kind of maybe inundated in the YouTube influencer culture of trans men, and it presents a very glossy, unrealistic experience. It's steeped in the ideology and whatnot, and there needs to be an alternative out there for young questioning people. Yeah,
and that's very much the spirit in which I created Gender Dysphoria Alliance Canada. Is I wanted to be a place of storytelling. Right, that isn't about marketing. It's that's just, because most of our stories don't really align with the branding of everything trans right now.
Yeah.
And so I wanted, but not everyone feels comfortable because of this political climate where people feel attacked anytime they contradict the narrative.
Yeah.
Not everyone feels safe to tell their story in an open and honest way. So I hope to create a platform for people that, even if they need to do it anonymously, but to try to get their stories out.
Good. Yeah.
Whether that's a detransitioner story or ROGD story, or people that are happy with their transition, but just want to talk openly about what that means for them.
Yeah.
To open this up, to humanize this actual experience and be honest and truthful about it. As an alternative to the marketing and branding.
Yep, absolutely. And I think we should get get as many people kind of on this, talking with us on here as possible, as well as originally I was thinking trans men, but why not get, the Debbie Haytons and, other trans women on here as well? Because that's obviously just as important, to hear their perspective.
We have quite a hefty community
network. We sure do. Yeah.
Of people exactly the way we do. So we need to make sure that, because I feel like the trans community, and this isn't new, the trans community has always had it's never been one community. It's sort of been these kind of two major streams and nuances within those streams, but two primary streams. And I feel like our side of the trans community, our voices have been silenced in this whole public discourse.
Yeah.
And maybe because we are just living our lives, and I think a lot of people that think the way we do are probably pretty oblivious to how this is playing out on the social stage and what that will mean for us moving forward when there's an eventual backlash, and interpreting that backlash as transphobia and
exactly
on all of us. And it's this very tiny cohort of our community that's been speaking on our behalf. Mostly PGPs, as you said, is my interpretation. Blanchard has said that as well. So I don't think we're off base here. A lot of people are seeing that, speaking on our behalf and ruining it for all of us. And leading us down this path where it's going to start to become unsafe for all of us. So it's important we take this back and take the narrative back.
Indeed. When I got wind of it again, like about 3 years ago, it was kind of like I had a decision to make. Was I going to duck my head down, go stealth, because I knew the ship was sinking at that point? It's like, or do I help get people off of it, or kind of just it was like either go under. And I think a lot of people have woken up to some of our ilk are oblivious to it still, but I think a significant portion are aware of it and have made that decision to go completely stealth and just check out of the whole conversation. And then a few of us are like, no, we need to throw the veil off and expose this for what it is, and not in a bad way, but in a way that's like there could be a lot of good that we can do here to correct the direction that it's going in.
I agree. Well, I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, me as well. Me as well. Awesome. Do you want to start plan on something regular? Maybe, I mean, Sunday mornings are would probably work for me. I'm not sure if you have a what your schedule looks like on a recurring
Yeah, normally
basis.
that works really well for me too. Everyone here sleeps in Sunday mornings, so it's a great
There we
time.
go.
I get up a bit earlier, and I'm
Okay.
gonna stop record now, and we can just have a
Okay.
chat.